北美王律明暗追踪。Hello， 大家好，我是北美王律，欢迎收看我的频道。现在是台北时间2026年2月22号星期天，咱们继续来聊台海局势和两岸关系最新最爆款的新闻。各位朋友，请大家抓紧时间，坐稳扶好，系紧安全带，咱们直接进入主题了。今天呢，我想问你一句话：如果有一天西方不再讨论气候目标了，不再讨论全球规则了，不再讨论历史反省了，而是公开讲出了一句话，说我们不能再退了，你会不会意识到时代真的变了呢？最近就在慕尼黑安全会议的现场，美国国务卿卢比奥讲了一段话，全场那是集体起立疯狂鼓掌啊！那不是礼貌性的掌声，那是一种压抑了很多年的情绪，突然找到了突破口。因为卢比奥讲的不是外交辞令，他讲的是文明。很多人不知道，慕尼黑这个地方本身就带着冷战的记忆。1963年是第一届慕尼黑安全会议召开的时间，那个时候柏林墙才刚刚竖起来，古巴导弹危机差点把世界推到了核毁灭的边缘。在那个时代，西方在问一个问题：我们还能活下去吗？但是今天60多年之后，卢比奥站在了同一个会场，问的问题变了，不是我们能不能活，而是我们还是不是原来的我们自己。冷战结束之后，西方曾经沉浸在一个幻觉里面，认为历史终结了，市场会带来和平，全球化会消弭冲突，供应链互相依存会让战争变得不可能。这个理想听起来很美，但是现实呢？制造业流失，供应链外包，能源依赖，战略自主性下降。当西方企业把关键产业转移出去的时候，他们以为自己是在赚钱，但他们同时把自己的命门交了出去。这就是卡脖子这3个字背后真正的焦虑啊！卢比奥讲得很直接，去工业化不是命运的必然，是政策的选择。供应链的失控不是全球化的必然，是错误的自愿转移。这句话对欧洲来说是相当震撼的，因为它等于是否定了过去30年来的认知，30年来的共识呀。更关键的是，卢比奥把安全重新放回到了文明的框架里面。他说，军队不是为抽象的原则作战，军队是为人民而战，为国家而战，为生活方式而战。这句话看似普通，但它其实在重新定义整个西方的战略思维。西方不再只是贸易的联盟，不再只是规则的制定者，而是一个文明的共同体。这种语气你在冷战之后几乎听不到啊。卢比奥谈到中国的时候讲得非常的冷静，他说2个大国的利益不可能完全一致，我们必须沟通，必须管理冲突，但是不能牺牲国家的利益。这不是情绪的对骂，这是文明竞争的宣告啊。他其实在画出一条线，这条线不是战争的线，而是战略的边界线。西方不再天真地相信市场会自动解决一切，西方开始承认一个事实：供应链依赖是风险，能源依赖更是风险，战略产业外包是风险中的风险。这就是对中国正式亮剑的真正含义。西方要收回战略主导权。卢比奥的这场演讲是冷战以来最伟大的演讲，他重新让西方文明这个词回到了主舞台上。在一个碎片化、焦虑化的时代，有人敢讲大的叙事，这本身就是一种力量啊！我们不妨一起来听听卢比奥的这场慕尼黑演讲全文。这场演讲具有划时代的意义，可以说是对西方极左派的力挽狂澜，把西方文明的风向集体带向了右转。这场演讲很可能奠定美国和欧洲未来几十年的发展方向，也预示着欧美左派的衰落和右派的复兴。百年未有之大变局很可能由卢比奥的这篇演讲开始，请您务必认真听，仔细听，用心听。听完之后，相信您可能会有所领悟。
Thank you very much. We gather here today as members of a historic alliance, an alliance that saved and changed the world. You know, when this conference began in 1963, it was in a nation, actually it was on a continent, that was divided against itself. The line between communism and freedom ran through the heart of Germany. The first barbed fences of the Berlin Wall had gone up just 2 years prior. And just months before that first conference, before our predecessors first met here in Munich, the Cuban Missile Crisis had brought the world to the brink of nuclear destruction. Even as World War II still burned fresh in the memory of Americans and Europeans alike, we found ourselves staring down the barrel of a new global catastrophe, one with the potential for a new kind of destruction, more apocalyptic and final than anything before in the history of mankind. The time of that first gathering, Soviet communism was on the march. Thousands of years of Western civilization hung in the balance. At that time, victory was far from certain. But we were driven by a common purpose. We were unified not just by what we were fighting against. We were unified by what we were fighting for. And together, Europe and America prevailed. And a continent was rebuilt. Our people prospered. In time, the East and West blocks were reunited. A civilization was once again made whole. That infamous wall that had cleaved this nation into two came down, and with it, an evil empire. And the East and West became one again. But the euphoria of this triumph led us to a dangerous delusion that we had entered, quote, the end of history, that every nation would now be a liberal democracy, that the ties formed by trade and by commerce alone would now replace nationhood, that the rules-based global order, an overused term, would now replace the national interest, and that we would now live in a world without borders where everyone became a citizen of the world. This was a foolish idea that ignored both human nature and it ignored the lessons of over 5,000 years of recorded human history. And it has cost us dearly. In this delusion, we embraced a dogmatic vision of free and unfettered trade, even as some nations protected their economies and subsidized their companies to systematically undercut ours, shuttering our plants, resulting in large parts of our societies being deindustrialized, shipping millions of working and middle-class jobs overseas, and handing control of our critical supply chains to both adversaries and rivals. We increasingly outsourced our sovereignty to international institutions while many nations invested in massive welfare states at the cost of maintaining the ability to defend themselves. This, even as other countries have invested in the most rapid military buildup in all of human history and have not hesitated to use hard power to pursue their own interests. To appease a climate cult, we have imposed energy policies on ourselves that are impoverishing our people, even as our competitors exploit oil and coal and natural gas and anything else, not just to power their economies, but to use as leverage against our own. And in a pursuit of a world without borders, we opened our doors to an unprecedented wave of mass migration that threatens the cohesion of our societies, the continuity of our culture, and the future of our people. We made these mistakes together. And now, together, we owe it to our people to face those facts and to move forward, to rebuild. Under President Trump, the United States of America will once again take on the task of renewal and restoration, driven by a vision of a future as proud, as sovereign, and as vital as our civilization's past. And while we are prepared, if necessary, to do this alone, it is our preference and it is our hope to do this together with you, our friends here in Europe. For the United States and Europe, we belong together. America was founded 250 years ago But the roots began here on this continent long before. The men who settled and built the nation of my birth arrived on our shores carrying the memories and the traditions and the Christian faith of their ancestors as a sacred inheritance, an unbreakable link between the old world and the new. We are part of one civilization, Western civilization. We are bound to one another by the deepest bonds that nations could share, forged by centuries of shared history, Christian faith, culture, heritage, language, ancestry, and the sacrifices our forefathers made together for the common civilization to which we have fallen heir. And so this is why we Americans may sometimes come off as a little direct and urgent in our counsel. This is why President Trump demands seriousness and reciprocity from our friends here in Europe. The reason why, my friends, is because we care deeply. We care deeply about your future and ours. And if at times we disagree, our disagreements come from our profound sense of concern about a Europe with which we are connected, not just economically, not just militarily. We are connected spiritually, and we are connected culturally. We want Europe to be strong. We believe that Europe must survive. Because the two great wars of the last century serve for us as history's constant reminder that ultimately our destiny is and will always be intertwined with yours. Because we know that the fate of Europe will never be irrelevant to our own. National security, which this conference is largely about, is not merely a series of technical questions. How much we spend on defense or where, how we deploy it, these are important questions. They are. But they are not the fundamental one. The fundamental question we must answer at the outset is, what exactly are we defending? Because armies do not fight for abstractions. Armies fight for a people. Armies fight for a nation. Armies fight for a way of life. And that is what we are defending. A great civilization that has every reason to be proud of its history, confident of its future, and aims to always be the master of its own economic and political destiny. It was here, in Europe, where the ideas that planted the seeds of liberty that changed the world were born. It was here, in Europe, which gave the world the rule of law, the universities, and the scientific revolution. It was this continent that produced the genius of Mozart and Beethoven, of Dante and Shakespeare, of Michelangelo and Da Vinci, of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. And this is the place where the vaulted ceilings of the Sistine Chapel and the towering spires of the great cathedral in Cologne, they testify not just to the greatness of our past or to a faith in God that inspired these marvels. They foreshadow the wonders that await us in our future. But only if we are unapologetic in our heritage and proud of this common inheritance can we together begin the work of envisioning and shaping our economic and our political future. Deindustrialization was not inevitable. It was a conscious policy choice, a decades-long economic undertaking that stripped our nations of their wealth, of their productive capacity, and of their independence. And the loss of our supply chain sovereignty was not a function of a prosperous and healthy system of global trade. It was foolish. It was a foolish but voluntary transformation of our economy that left us dependent on others for our needs and dangerously vulnerable to crisis. Mass migration isn't some fringe concern of little consequence. It was and continues to be a crisis which is transforming and destabilizing societies all across the West. Together, we can reindustrialize our economies and rebuild our capacity to defend our people. But the work of this new alliance should not be focused just on military cooperation and reclaiming the industries of the past. It should also be focused on together advancing our mutual interests in new frontiers, unshackling our ingenuity, our creativity, and the dynamic spirit to build a new Western century. Commercial space travel and cutting-edge artificial intelligence, industrial automation and flex manufacturing, creating a Western supply chain for critical minerals not vulnerable to extortion from other powers, and a unified effort to compete for market share in the economies of the global South. Together, we can not only take back control of our own industries and supply chains, we can prosper in the areas that will define the 21st century. But we must also gain control of our national borders. Controlling who and how many people enter our countries, this is not an expression of xenophobia. It is not hate. It is a fundamental act of national sovereignty. And the failure to do so is not just an abdication of one of our most basic duties owed to our people. It is an urgent threat to the fabric of our societies and the survival of our civilization itself. And finally, we can no longer place the so-called global order above the vital interests of our people and our nations. We do not need to abandon the system of international cooperation we authored, and we don't need to dismantle the global institutions of the old order that together we built. But these must be reformed. These must be rebuilt. For example, the United Nations still has tremendous potential to be a tool for good in the world. But we cannot ignore that today, on the most pressing matters before us, it has no answers and has played virtually no role. It could not solve the war in Gaza. Instead, it was American leadership that freed captives from barbarians and brought about a fragile truce. It has not solved the war in Ukraine. It took American leadership in partnership with many of the countries here today just to bring the two sides to the table in search of a still elusive peace. It was powerless to constrain the nuclear program of radical Shia clerics in Tehran. That required 14 bombs dropped with precision from American B-2 bombers. And it was unable to address the threat to our security from a narco-terrorist dictator in Venezuela. Instead, it took American special forces to bring this fugitive to justice. In a perfect world, all of these problems and more would be solved by diplomats and strongly worded resolutions. But we do not live in a perfect world, and we cannot continue to allow those who blatantly and openly threaten our citizens and endanger our global stability to shield themselves behind abstractions of international law which they themselves routinely violate. This is the path that President Trump and the United States has embarked upon. It is the path we ask you here in Europe to join us on. It is a path we have walked together before and hope to walk together again. For 5 centuries, before the end of the Second World War, the West had been expanding. Its missionaries, its pilgrims, its soldiers, its explorers pouring out from its shores to cross oceans, settle new continents, build vast empires extending out across the globe. But in 1945, for the first time since the age of Columbus, it was contracting. Europe was in ruins. Half of it lived behind an iron curtain, and the rest looked like it would soon follow. The great Western empires had entered into terminal decline, accelerated by godless communist revolutions and by anti-colonial uprisings that would transform the world and drape the red hammer and sickle across vast swaths of the map in the years to come. Against that backdrop, then, as now, many came to believe that the West's age of dominance had come to an end, and that our future was destined to be a faint and feeble echo of our past. But together, our predecessors recognized that decline was a choice, and it was a choice they refused to make. This is what we did together once before, and this is what President Trump and the United States want to do again now, together with you. And this is why we do not want our allies to be weak, because that makes us weaker. We want allies who can defend themselves so that no adversary will ever be tempted to test our collective strength. This is why we do not want our allies to be shackled by guilt and shame. We want allies who are proud of their culture and of their heritage, who understand that we are heirs to the same great and noble civilization, and who together with us are willing and able to defend it. And this is why we do not want allies to rationalize the broken status quo rather than reckon with what is necessary to fix it. For we in America have no interest in being polite and orderly caretakers of the West's managed decline. We do not seek to separate, but to revitalize an old friendship and renew the greatest civilization in human history. What we want is a reinvigorated alliance that recognizes that what has ailed our societies is not just a set of bad policies, but a malaise of hopelessness and complacency. An alliance is the alliance that we want is one that is not paralyzed into inaction by fear. Fear of climate change, fear of war, fear of technology. Instead, we want an alliance that boldly races into the future. And the only fear we have is the fear of the shame of not leaving our nations prouder, stronger, and wealthier for our children. An alliance ready to defend our people, to safeguard our interests, and to preserve the freedom of action that allows us to shape our own destiny. Not one that exists to operate a global welfare state and atone for the purported sins of past generations. An alliance that does not allow its power to be outsourced, constrained, or subordinated to systems beyond its control. One that does not depend on others for the critical necessities of its national life. And one that does not maintain the polite pretense that our way of life is just one among many, and that asks for permission before it acts. And above all, an alliance based on the recognition that we, the West, have inherited together. What we have inherited together is something that is unique and distinctive and irreplaceable, because this, after all, is the very foundation of the transatlantic bond. Acting together in this way, we will not just help recover a sane foreign policy, it will restore to us a clear sense of ourselves. It will restore a place in the world. And in so doing, it will rebuke and deter the forces of civilizational erasure that today menace both America and Europe alike. So in a time of headlines heralding the end of the transatlantic era, let it be known and clear to all that this is neither our goal nor our wish. Because for us Americans, our home may be in the Western Hemisphere, but we will always be a child of Europe. Our story began with an Italian explorer whose adventure into the great unknown to discover a new world brought Christianity to the Americas and became the legend that defined the imagination of our pioneer nation. Our first colonies were built by English settlers, to whom we owe not just the language we speak, but the whole of our political and legal system. Our frontiers were shaped by Scots-Irish, that proud, hardy clan from the hills of Ulster that gave us Davy Crockett and Mark Twain and Teddy Roosevelt and Neil Armstrong. Our great Midwestern heartland was built by German farmers and craftsmen who transformed empty plains into a global agricultural powerhouse. And by the way, dramatically upgraded the quality of American beer. Our expansion into the interior followed the footsteps of French fur traders and explorers whose names, by the way, still adorn the street signs and town names all across the Mississippi Valley. Our horses, our ranches, our rodeos, the entire romance of the cowboy archetype that became synonymous with the American West. These were born in Spain. And our largest and most iconic city was named New Amsterdam before it was named New York. And you know that in the year that my country was founded, Lorenzo and Catalina Giraldi lived in Casal Monferrato in the Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia. And Jose and Manuela Reina lived in Sevilla, Spain. I don't know what, if anything, they knew about the 13 colonies which had gained their independence from the British Empire. But here's what I'm certain of. They could have never imagined that 250 years later, one of their direct descendants would be back here today on this continent, as the chief diplomat of that infant nation. And yet here I am, reminded by my own story that both our histories and our fates will always be linked. Together, we rebuilt a shattered continent in the wake of 2 devastating world wars. When we found ourselves divided once again by the Iron Curtain, the Free West linked arms with the courageous dissidents struggling against tyranny in the East to defeat Soviet communism. We have fought against each other, then reconciled, then fought, then reconciled again. And we have bled and died side by side on battlefields from Kapyong to Kandahar. And I'm here today to leave it clear that America is charting the path for a new century of prosperity, and that once again, we want to do it together with you, our cherished allies and our oldest friends. We want to do it together with you, with a Europe that is proud of its heritage and of its history, with a Europe that has the spirit of creation and liberty that sent ships out into uncharted seas and birthed our civilization, with a Europe that has the means to defend itself and the will to survive. We should be proud of what we achieved together in the last century, but now we must confront and embrace the opportunities of a new one. Because yesterday is over. The future is inevitable. And our destiny together awaits. Thank you.
Mr. Secretary, I'm not sure you heard the sigh of relief through this hall when we were just listening to what I would interpret as a message of reassurance, of partnership. You spoke of intertwined relations between the United States and Europe. Reminds me of statements made decades ago by your predecessors when the discussion was, is actually America a European power? Is America a power in Europe? Thank you for offering this message of reassurance about our partnership. This is actually not the first time that Marco Rubio is here at the Munich Security Conference. He's been here before, a couple of times, but it's the first time he has been, and he is the speaker as Secretary of State. So thank you again. We have only a couple of minutes now for just a few questions. And if I may, we collected questions from the audience. One of the sort of key issues here yesterday, today, is of course, continues to be the question of how to deal with the war in Ukraine. Many of us in the discussions of the last 24 hours, have voiced their impression that the Russians, let me put it colloquially, the Russians are playing for time. They're not really interested in a meaningful settlement. There is no indication that they're willing to compromise on any of their maximalist objectives. Offer to us, if you could, your assessment of where we are and where you think we can go.
Well, I think where we are at this point is that the issues at play that have to be, here's the good news. The good news is that the issues that need to be confronted to end this war have been narrowed. That's the good news. The bad news is they've been narrowed to the hardest questions to answer, and work remains to be done in that front. I hear your point about, well, the answer is we don't know. We don't know if the Russians are serious about ending the war. They say they are, and under what terms they were willing to do it, and whether we can find terms that are acceptable to Ukraine upon that Russia will always agree to. But we're going to continue to test it. In the meantime, everything else continues to happen. The United States has imposed additional sanctions on Russia's oil. In our conversations with India, we've gotten their commitment to stop buying additional Russian oil. Europe has taken its set of steps moving forward. The Pearl program continues, in which American weaponry is being sold for the Ukrainian war effort. So all these things continue. Nothing has stopped in the interim. So there's no buying of time here in that regard. What we can't answer, but we're going to continue to test, is whether there is an outcome that Ukraine can live with and that Russia will accept. And I would say it's been elusive up to this point. We've made progress in the sense that for the first time, I think, in years, at least at the technical level, there were military officials from both sides that met together last week, and there'll be meetings again on Tuesday, although it may not be the same group of people. Look, we're going to continue to do everything we can to play this role of bringing this war to the end. I don't think anybody in this room would be against a negotiated settlement to this war so long as the conditions are just and sustainable. And that's what we aim to achieve, and we're going to continue to try to achieve it, even as all these other things continue to happen on the sanctions front and so forth.
Thank you very much. I'm sure if we had more time, there would be many questions on Ukraine. But let me conclude by asking a question about something entirely different. The next speaker here in just a couple of minutes will be the Foreign Minister of China. When you served in the Senate, sir, people considered you a kind of a China hawk.
So did they.
So did they.
Yeah.
We know that there will be, in about 2 months' time, a summit meeting between President Trump and President Xi Jinping. Give us your expectation. Are you optimistic? Can there be a quote-unquote deal with China? What do you expect?
Well, I would say this. The two largest economies in the world, two of the big powers on the planet, we have an obligation to communicate with them and talk, and so do many of you on a bilateral basis as well. I mean, it would be geopolitical malpractice to not be in conversations with China. I would say this, because we're two large countries with huge global interests, our national interests will often not align. Their national interests and ours will not align, and we owe it to the world to try to manage those as best we can, obviously avoiding conflict, both economic and worse. And so it's important for us to have communications with them in that regard. On areas in which our interests are aligned, I think we can work together to make positive impact on the world, and we seek opportunities to do that with them. But we have to have a relationship with China, and many of the countries represented here today are going to have a relationship with China, always understanding that nothing that we agree to could come at the expense of our national interest. And frankly, we expect China to act in their national interest, as we expect every nation state to act in their national interest. And the goal of diplomacy is to try to navigate those times in which our national interests come into conflict with one another, always hoping to do it peacefully. I think we also have a special obligation, because whatever happens between the U.S. and China on trade has a global implication. So there are long-term challenges that we face that we're going to have to confront, that are going to be irritants in our relationship with China. That's not just true for the United States, that's true for the broader West. But I do think we need to try to manage those the best we can to avoid, unnecessary friction if it's possible. But no one is under any illusions. There are some fundamental challenges between our countries and between the West and China that will continue for the foreseeable future for a variety of reasons. And it's some of the things we hope to work together with you on.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. We've run out of time. I'm sorry that I can't take questions from all those who wanted to ask questions. Mr. Secretary of State, thank you for this message of reassurance. I think this is much appreciated here in the hall. Let's offer a round of applause.
朋友们，卢比奥的这个演讲发生在2026年的2月14号，大约1周前，慕尼黑安全会议的现场。美国国务卿马可·卢比奥一开口，欧洲领导人从礼貌鼓掌到频频点头，到最后竟然全场起立疯狂鼓掌，掌声如雷，响了好几十秒钟啊！有的人眼泪都快掉下来了。福克斯新闻 YouTube 的官方影片都有拍到，德国防长、法国外长、欧盟高官一个一个都站起来给这位美国人鼓掌，鼓到手红。为什么？因为这不是外交客套，这是冷战之后西方最硬、最燃、最直球的一记重拳。 卢比奥没有直接骂中共，但字字句句都在剑指中国。去工业化是谁补贴企业，系统性打击西方工厂的？供应链控制权拱手让给了谁呢？关键矿产被谁勒索？能源被谁当武器卡脖子？全球南方市场被谁抢占了？联合国无能，又是谁在背后撑腰？卢比奥的这篇演讲就是西方文明对中共的正式亮剑呢。川普 2.0 时代以来，美欧联手拒绝当中共的供应链奴隶。这篇演讲让人听完热血沸腾，背脊发凉，然后就彻底的醒了。不知道您准备好没有？我们来一起深入探讨。1963年慕尼黑会议初创的时候，召开第一届会议的时候，那个时候柏林墙才刚刚筑起，古巴导弹危机把世界推到了核战的边缘，苏联共产主义汹涌前进，西方文明悬于一线。但美欧因为共同的信仰、共同的牺牲，一起打赢了。柏林墙倒了，邪恶的帝国崩了。但胜利之后，欧美文明掉进了历史终结的陷阱，以为贸易取代了国家，规则取代了利益，世界没有边界了，大家都变成一家人，变成了世界公民了，主推全球一体化了。对此，卢比奥怒吼一声，震惊全场啊！这是愚蠢，忽略了人性，忽略了5000年的历史，它让我们付出了惨重的代价。什么代价呢？兄弟，您听清楚了，这就是在说中国呀。第一，去工业化。西方傻乎乎地拥抱了那些什么无限制的自由贸易，结果某些国家是谁，大家心里都清楚。某些国家保护自己的经济，疯狂补贴企业，系统性地打垮自由世界的工厂，数百万蓝领中产工作被运到了海外，关键的供应链拱手让给了对手和竞争者。这不就是在说中共的国企补贴倾销，把美国袖带、欧洲工业区全毁掉吗？卢比奥说，这不是必然，是我们自愿的愚蠢选择，让我们依赖别人，危机时极度脆弱呀。第二，主权外包，我们把主权交给了国际机构，有些国家砸钱大搞福利，不搞国防，别人却史上最快的建军扩战，用硬实力追求利益。这所谓的硬实力，不就是在说中共的军事扩张、对台威胁、南海霸凌吗？第三，能源自残，西方为了气候给自己套枷锁，人民变穷了，竞争对手用石油、煤炭、天然气当武器，反过来卡我们的脖子，这就是在暗指俄罗斯能源加中国控制的全球能源链呢。第四，大规模移民，无边界世界带来移民浪潮，威胁社会的凝聚力、文化的连续性、人民的未来。虽然没有直说，但保守派都知道，这也是中共超限战的一部分，制造西方的内乱。卢比奥大声怒吼，这些错误我们一起犯的，现在我们要一起面对，一起重建。然后重磅来了，在川普总统的领导下，美国将承担复兴的任务。美国准备独自来做，但更希望和欧洲一起来做，因为美国和欧洲本是一家人。这句本来就是一家，现场掌声燃爆啊！卢比奥说，美欧联手可以建立独立的供应链，夺回主权，不让中共再用矿产当武器。控制边境是主权的基本，如果不做，就是对文明的威胁。全球秩序不能高于国家利益。联合国在加沙、乌克兰、伊朗核武、委内瑞拉等问题上毫无作为，是美国领导解决了。我们不能让威胁者用国际法来保护自己，这就是川普的路。卢比奥现在邀请欧洲一起加入，我们以前一起走过的，现在让我们一起再携手。美国不想要软弱的盟友，不想要内疚、羞耻、束缚的盟友，想要那些为自己的文化而自豪、愿意捍卫自己文明的盟友。美国不愿意当西方衰落的看守人，美国要重振友谊，更新最伟大的西方文明。美国想要的联盟是不被恐惧瘫痪，无惧气候，不怕战争，敢搞科技， 大胆地冲向未来，唯一恐惧的就是没让自己的孩子们感到骄傲。不搞全球福利，不赎罪，不外包权力，不依赖他人，不假装我们的生活方式只是其中之一。欧美历史的命运原本是相连的，2次大战重建了大陆，击败了苏联，他们一起流过血。今天美国为新世纪繁荣开路，再次希望和欧洲一起，与自豪遗产的欧洲、自由精神的欧洲、自卫意志的欧洲一起走向未来。昨天已经结束了，未来不可避免，欧美的命运共同体正在等待着。朋友们，这就是神级的演讲啊！卢比奥用爱、用历史、用骄傲在对欧洲说，醒过来吧，别再让中国卡脖子了。供应链独立，关键矿产脱钩，再工业化，全球南方争夺，这就是剑指中共的宣言呐。中共补贴企业毁西方的工厂，控制稀土、锂电池、卡电动车、军事、科技、能源，全被他们勒索。联合国无能，中共在背后撑腰，全球多极化。但是卢比奥告诉我们，衰落是一种选择，我们原本可以拒绝的。美欧联手，西方文明将再次亮剑。看完之后我是彻底的醒了，不知道您呢？中共的超限战、供应链战、经济战已经让西方流血，卢比奥呼吁西方一起携手，现在是时候反击了。如果你在北美、欧洲、台湾、香港看着西方一步步被中共渗透、经济绑架，希望您仔细回味一下卢比奥的这次演讲，尽早醒过来。分享这个影片，让更多人看到卢比奥的亮剑。点赞留言告诉我，您最震撼的是哪句抗中的暗语呢？订阅，打开小铃铛，我们继续聊川普 2.0 抗中、供应链独立和文明的存亡之战。西方不能亡，我们不怕中共，只怕子孙失望。谢谢大家，我们下期再见。上帝保佑西方，上帝保佑自由世界，请亮剑吧。